Okay, welcome everyone to the May 2023 Microsoft 365 Modern Management Meetup. Only two of the regular hosts are here tonight. One of them is, we'll assume that Jerome is stuck in traffic somewhere. So it's breakfast time for him somewhere. So he's probably spilled his coffee while he's driving or something along those lines. And Ben has been traveling a bit too much and has had to do that thing that sometimes is easy not to do, which is spend some quality time with family. So Ben should be back next month and Jerome should be back next month. So my name's Mike O'Shea on Twitter at InTunedIn, and I'll hand over to Stephen, who's Steve's advertising today. That's not like you.
What do you mean? What do you mean I'm advertising?
Your shirt.
Oh, it's nice, isn't
it? You didn't even realize.
I was doing some internal. I was doing some internal training today, so I thought I'd wear it. So I'm Steve Hosking. You can find me at Twitter at OnPrem Cloud Guy. And yeah, I'm the resident Microsoft person to talk stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump on in. So just the breakdown for today. Probably just the first thing we'll go through is just if there's anyone new or who's been absent for a while, who just wants to sort of drop some comments into chat or unmute just to let us know that you're here, why you're here, etc. Then we'll switch over just to talk about, I've just sort of picked a few things that I thought were worth discussing in terms of news items. One of them's kind of special because it relates to Teams, and Teams being something that we don't normally talk about, but there's a reason why I've included it in here that I think will sort of, maybe make some of you go, oh, I might need to revisit some of this stuff. And then obviously the big one for today is Windows lapse. So this is one where I'll be blunt and say there has been a lot of excitement about the update to Windows lapse. And as much as the convenience such as now it becoming part of the operating system as of April is like, to me, that's a big one. But the fact that now we can actually use it alongside Azure AD for storage and use Intune, etc. So we'll talk through that. We've got at least one, maybe two different demo tenants that we may use today, depending on how things go. One of them, the VM only just sort of got configured and enrolled. So fingers crossed that one is working, but we've got backups. And then the final piece that we've got on here, general discussion. This is just really where we just set aside some time at the end. If anyone's got any questions that they want to ask after the main session, that you don't want them recorded as part of the main session. So this is just where we don't sort of say or do anything too bad. It's just when people sort of don't want a recorded evidence of questions they may have asked or scenarios they may have proposed. So if there's anything that you're kind of uncomfortable asking that you don't want a long-term record of, general discussion area, we stop the recording once we get to that, so everyone can be pretty open with each other at that stage. So just the first thing then is if we jump in and just sort of go through introductions. So just sort of looking through the name, it looks like most of the names I know. Anyone sort of jumping out who hasn't attended previously and wants to do a quick introduction, either via chat or you can unmute to do an intro?
Yeah, I will.
Hey, Richard.
That's okay.
Yep.
My name's Richard, and we have a MSP on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and one of my friends recommended that I join Meetup to sort of get a bit more understanding on the modern management side of things, but also so I can start socializing again. And I think it's important to, connect with people that are good at their craft and learn from other people. So that's why I'm here. And yes, I want to say hello and welcome.
Oh, excellent. Welcome. And how is the weather on the Gold Coast at the moment?
At the moment, it's pretty good, actually. I haven't had rain for a couple of weeks. I work remotely in Taupo in New Zealand, and
okay,
it's been pissing down over there. So the wife and kids have been stuck inside. So yeah, it's the change in weather is good, but yeah.
It's been, so Yes, I've been to Taupo once, and it was for us. I know this is going to shock a few people, but it was actually for a sporting event where I represented Australia. And I know that's catching people off guard, where they're going, I didn't know Mark has done, I'll say it was sporting, but I'm not going to say it was athletic. And it's not a sport that's in the Olympics. But you still get drug tested by ASADA, so you get the worst of all worlds.
Drinking at the bar is not an Olympic sport, so therefore it could be that.
I might even still, once at any point, if Steve jumps in and has sort of got a bunch of stuff he wants to get off his chest, I'll use that distraction to see if I've still got the very tasteful Team Australia tracksuit floating around.
Are you going to divulge what sport it was, or do we have to keep guessing?
I think the tracksuit. If I can find the tracksuit, it will give it away.
Do it.
Okay. No, but I guess though, if you Taupo was really nice though. Anyone else who's new? We've got Barani has just sort of commented in chat, so down in Melbourne. So welcome along. And Aresh, good to see you again. You're now a regular.
I know. It's become
you know what that means?
No.
You have to answer questions as well.
Sure, happy to. In fact, I think we could talk about a lot of developments in the AVD and all of that Win365 space next session, probably.
Oh, okay, yeah. So there's anytime we can come up with a topic for the following month, and someone else is volunteering for it, we are more than happy for that.
Yes. No worries. All good.
Yeah.
And we'll be off probably.
Excellent. Okay, so just then moving on to just a couple of news items. I picked these not necessarily because of the importance of them, but just because there's a few talking points that I just wanted to sort of go over with people about them. And the first one is around, a more exposure of Windows issues through the M365 Admin Center. So I guess I've just got a couple of questions that I want to ask before we discuss this. So those of you who really sort of view your role more as like Windows administration or desktop support, do you ever go to the M365 Admin Center for any purpose whatsoever? Or is everything that you want to do generally going to be over in Intune or AAD? So this is just a personal curiosity piece that I just want to check on. So would you think to go to the M365 Admin Center to look for Windows information, as in support related issues?
Nope.
If I have been through the billing something, how much they would charge and all, the registration, subscriptions and all.
That makes sense. Yeah, the licensing and subscriptions.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So in this case, so the reason why I asked that was that when this information was shared with us that this was coming, like the big question that I had was, like, if somebody is like a pure Windows, or not a pure Windows admin, but very Windows issue focused, etc. Like I was curious about, just do they even use the M365 Admin Center? And the logic that I was applying to that was that because it started its life off as the Office 365 Admin Center, it hasn't necessarily been something that either Windows admins have known about, or if they did know about it, they just didn't think it was appropriate for them. But over the last couple of years, so those of you who do check it, and I'm guessing for quite a few of you that are on here, we've probably got a bit of a weirder mixed audience where a lot of you probably just aren't, device management or Windows focused. A lot of you have probably got other like Office 365 or M365 related things that you do in that portal anyway. Now, the thing that's changed with this, and we can take a look at it in just a minute, is that now you can start signing up for email alerts around Windows known issues. And some of the things that are kind of interesting about this let's sort of just jump down to this fourth bullet point here. So the conversation so far seems to be that they're going to be more in depth in terms of the information that's shared in the portal or in the admin center versus what you'd be seeing if you just went out to just the regular Windows information pages. So that's something where where they're basically saying, look, this is where they want people to have like a central place to go, and this is one of, or I shouldn't say one of the places. This is really the place where I guess the Windows comms team are starting to push people towards. Now, obviously, we don't have to use that. And if let me just jump out to the correct browser session. So even though like there's still things like the the Windows release health pages, so pretty much anyone can get out to this. It's just like and I'll I still want to call it docs. Like anything that's not learning path related. Is it easier if I just call it docs rather than learn? But I think learn gets a bit too confusing because it's a bit too all-encompassing. But so this is still, so what they're basically saying at the moment is that this will get you some of the information, but there'll actually be more information when you do go into release health over in the M365 admin center. And just if we jump over and take a quick look in there, I should have it opened on these pages. So the thing that they're starting to promote a bit more heavily over here is just over here with the known issues. So actually seeing what are the things that are happening right now. We can take a look at the preferences. So do we want to get those email notifications? Now, just a few talking points about.
I definitely need to get the updates for Windows 7.
Yeah, so some of this is. Yeah, so I think by default, everything is selected. And one of the bits of feedback that I heard from somebody was, make it so that it automatically detects what you've got in your environment and only alerts you about that. But I can see a bit of a flaw in that, which is if somebody depends on that, but they've got other things that aren't being managed in any way by M365, they're going to miss out on those alerts. So yeah, would it be nice if it auto-detected what you had and pre-selected them and then said, hey, are any of these other things? But just this option, I think, is easy enough. Pretty much you're catching everything. And yes, it does go back to Windows 7. It does go back to Server 2008 SP2. So basically anything that's...
Note as well there, though, it's only going back to Windows 10 20H2.
So it's supported versions or extended support versions.
Or ultra extended supported.
Yeah. Then the other, and this is something that sort of ties in a little bit to other things we'll cover I think in the next slide, is Steve, we're going to be talking about LTSC on the next slide.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know that you'll probably want to just sort of disappear for a few minutes, but no, don't worry. We're not saying anything good about it.
So the other thing, before we step onto that, while we're in this portal, I'd love to hijack it for a second as well.
Yeah. Yep.
And talk about service health. So how many people are aware of service health on the left-hand side? And also message center. So service health gives you the visibility of what's going on in the environment and everything associated around that. And this is a holistic view of saying there is some performance issues. There's issues, for example, there's a Microsoft Intune advisory at the moment. So this is where you should start looking and going, hang on, do I need to go and look here first? So a good example is, with the rapid security response for iOS and iPad OS, it's sitting there and sending messages to say, here you go, this is what's going on. The other cool one in here as well that I highly recommend keeping on top of is Message Center. So Message Center on the left-hand side gives us full visibility of what's coming for each of your products. And then you can go and create a planner syncing, and you can go and then track any of these new items that are coming through to go, I need to take action on it or I don't need to take action on it. Where that's powerful is if you've got a large amount of stuff coming through and there's, this is the notification for lapse in there. I'm going to put that into my pipeline and I'm going to action that. So it's automatically items that gives you that you can then go and track all the way through from a deployment point of view.
So with this, so you can see from here, like if you weren't aware that this stuff was in here, you can see where, like for the, for the Windows admin or the Intune admin, you can see that this stuff is quite useful. And sure, you could probably, you'd eventually find out a lot of this through Twitter or through just other conversations you're seeing in tech community, etc. But this is really, I guess, the more proactive way that Microsoft is getting it out, but targeting the people who are licensed for it. So that's the other thing in here, is that it's only going to be shooting through information on products, features, versions, editions, etc., that you've got licensing for. So if you don't have any like Windows 10 enterprise licenses in here, it's not going to be giving you, those Windows advisories, etc. So they're not just going to spam you with anything related to an M365 M365 E5 type subscription. Instead, it's just really focused on what it is that's in your environment. But this is also where you can start seeing that, yes, Windows admins, this is something that means that they're not relying on an RSS feed or relying on Twitter or things like that. And you can just sign up to get the different kinds of email notifications, etc. So, so if I jump over here to email, I can say that, hey, here are the things that I want. Now, in this case, because I do have to keep an eye on almost everything, unfortunately, I do have to select a lot more than I'm really all that interested in. But as an individual, when you're signing in, you can go through and configure this the way that you want it. So you don't need to be bombarded with like what an E5 plus additional stuff subscription includes. Just pick and choose what's appropriate for for your role. And I guess just my big take on this is that, like, if you are someone, like, unless you are someone who's a bit more Windows with Microsoft, or Windows or Intune with Microsoft 365, as opposed to working in a silo away from other M365 workloads, I think there are a lot of people who just don't know that this stuff is here. Or so yet alone, or even if it is, it may not be their first point of checking to see what's actually going on. Now, the other thing, just to sort of quickly talk about in here, or actually a few different things. So you saw that there were client and server editions in there. So pick and choose what's appropriate for you. If the M365 admin doesn't want to give the Windows admin too many permissions in there, you can just use the service support admin role, and that will just get you read access into that environment. And in this case, it's, this is what I was talking about before, where, that steering of content towards here. Now, I guess there are definitely pros and cons of doing it all through here. Sometimes you just want to go to a browser and not have to sign in and think about what tenant do I need to get to get this particular message sent a message. But at least there's basically quite a bit of thought going into how do they do this best. And then the final thing on here is that there is a US appropriate time, or maybe a Euro appropriate evening session. So on May the 24th or May the 25th, our time, stupidly, what would that be? That would be like 1 a.m. kind of time frame.
Or 3 a.m.
Okay, so a time where, unless you're a ridiculously early bird, you are not going to be joining it live, but hopefully they do, get in there and talk about it. Now, the thing that I'm kind of curious about, and why I think it's probably going to be worth checking on this to see what's in the recording, is because I have a big suspicion that information being exposed in Admin Center but not being exposed in other locations is probably going to raise quite a few eyebrows, because there'll be the information wants to be free crowd versus the I want targeted information that suits me in a known location. So that, for me, that would probably be the big takeaway from that one. Okay. So the Microsoft update team, they're not paying for the $8 a month for a blue tick.
It's working for us. I paid for two months and I decided to not pay anymore.
Yeah, seeing that there's now a backlash against people with blue ticks.
It's not worth it.
Okay. So this is this slide isn't actually really about what's on the slide at all. So let's talk about what's on the slide, then we'll talk about the things that are lurking beneath the surface of this slide. So like a couple of weeks ago, it was announced that 22H2 would be the last feature update for Windows 10. Now, any of you who've been running Windows 10 and following the feature updates, there really hasn't been a lot going on with them, and that's to be expected. You know, Windows 11 is here. It's where the feature update focus goes into. So that's basically the version of Windows 10 that people will have in a supported state until October 14, 2025. Now, here's where I think Steve probably knows where this conversation is going to go. So mute yourself, Steve, so you don't start swearing. No, okay. So
what are you talking about, Mark?
No. So the thing that this conversation inevitably is going to lead to with some people is so does that mean that we should switch to LTSC? And the answer to that is no. I think that's a pretty easy, black and white decision. And and if we take
the easy stance on that one is, if you think you need to run LTSC, do you need to run Office on it? If you need to run Office on it, you don't need to run LTSC. It's a pretty simple rule of thumb for most organizations. So
yeah,
it's not a hard, fast rule. There are caveats, but
yeah,
if you're needing to run Office, especially Microsoft 365 for enterprise applications that run on client side, you shouldn't be running them on LTSC because there's some security controls in the newer versions of Windows that don't get included in LTSC.
Yeah. And other things as well is like, so if your organization uses Surface devices at all, they've got a hardline stance. LTSC is not supported. Now, I guess one of the things that sort of makes LTSC a better story in general for us anyway moving forward is like from 2021 onwards, it's got that 5-year support life cycle instead of the 10-year support life cycle. And any of you who were around during that, the early days of Windows 10, there were a lot of people who got very, very interested in the original LTSC releases because of that 10-year support life cycle. And it was this means we can treat Windows the same way we've always treated it, and upgrade it every 5 years or whatever. They quickly found out that it wasn't the thing that they thought it was.
And I think the other thing that a lot of people looked at it for was it doesn't have all of this cloud crap, so therefore I don't need to worry about it, and it's going to mean that I can continue doing my on-prem config manager forever, because we'll never go to the cloud. And I wonder how well that's playing out for them now.
Yeah, I think they're probably all
have retired.
I'd say that they're, and look, and that was basically the thing with a lot of this. It was like that early time period with Win 10 and, and to be fair, Microsoft was doing a really bad job of communicating feature updates, starting from how often will they be released? Maybe 2 times, maybe 3 times a year. We'll see how we go. It took a while for them to get into the H1, H2 type release. Even though it took them a while to get into that naming scheme, they preferred to call it the Fall Update and the Fall Creators Update and other. What other names were there that didn't make sense to people on the other side of the world? Yeah, yes, Anniversary Edition. Again, anniversary of what? Your guess is as good as mine. So with this one, just be careful if anyone tries to sort of trying to steer themselves down the LTSC path, because what people will see here and where this all ties together is people who've got hardware that isn't natively going to be supported by Windows 11 are potentially going to start looking at things like LTSC and thinking that's the solution to the problem. But then once again, if they're running M365 apps, they're in trouble. If they want to run like Office 2019 or Office 2021 or whatever it's called, those are supported. But once again, they've got like a limited support lifetime. The life period that Office will be supported on those LTSC versions, Office Perpetual or Office LTSC, does not correspond to that 5-year life cycle of that. So just be careful there. If anyone's trying to get you down the LTSC path, like the way that I sort of try to position that is, if anyone says, oh, yeah, we're thinking about moving our fleet of devices to LTSC, the correct response is, or you say, no, that's not a valid option. If someone says, we've got particular devices and use case scenarios where we think LTSC might be appropriate, that's an okay conversation. But someone doing like a wholesale move of like older devices over to avoid Windows 11 compatibility issues or support issues, that's going to be a recipe for disaster for those orgs. It was a recipe for disaster years ago, and it will still be a recipe for disaster now. And then the other thing as well that I haven't got it on here, but the other thing I've seen people already starting to talk about here is that even though LTSC has dropped from a 10-year to a 5-year support lifecycle, Windows 10 IoT Enterprise is still at 10 years. So there'll be people who go, oh, well, that sounds even better. But there's a bunch of licensing restrictions, channel availability issues, et cetera, around IoT versions that I just don't think it's even worth investigating.
Well, it's a completely different SKU, and getting the IoT OS is a completely different licensing agreement.
Yeah, you've got to go through specialized distributors. So those of you who've sort of been working in channel roles over the years and have worked with, the different distributors who've sold like OEM product, et cetera, like unless things have changed in the last few years, they don't sell the IoT basically it used to be the embedded, Windows embedded, now it's IoT. Basically, that's a completely different distribution system, different distribution partners, different parts of Microsoft. So trying to get support on any of that, even if you do figure out how to sort of acquire it, just not worth the effort. And then final thing just on here is that yes, there's a Windows 11 LTSC that'll be released basically in a year and a half. Let's just say it should be available before December 31, 2024. Now, but I think in the meantime, I guess the thing here, and this is just a discussion that I wanted everyone to sort of chime in on, is let's say the Windows 11 hardware requirements, let's say they were announced about 2 years ago. Is that pretty close to 2 years? So let's say for those of you that saw those hardware changes as being really problematic within that first, when it was first announced 2 years ago, how many of you have had your views softened a bit just because that hardware is starting to age and some of those orgs are already either planning or partway through device replacement strategies anyway?
Things not so much from the OS.
Sorry, Dean, you're breaking up. Sorry, is it just me or is Dean breaking up?
No, Dean's breaking up.
I was saying, can you hear me?
Yep.
I can now, yeah.
I was saying that most of the influence seems to be from the additional applications like Office and Teams. Teams is a big driver for upgrading hardware, it seems.
Yeah.
But the OS itself doesn't seem to get any slower as time goes by. I mean, Windows 10, Windows 11, same really.
Yeah, and the reason why I sort of wanted to spend a bit of time on this topic was that recently there were some people that I didn't expect to be on the Microsoft needs to drop the Windows 11 hardware requirements bandwagon, and they were like people whose opinions I have had respect for in the past, that based on some of the things that they were saying about this, for me, it was just me thinking, oh, you don't really know what you're talking about here. And what you want versus what's going to happen probably is not going to align. So undoubtedly, there are going to be some orgs that, do have a bunch of devices that, are not going to take Windows 11 in a supported manner. Interpret that however you want. But even based on what we've seen in the past, when people hit some of that kind of stuff, if they need to keep running XP because of a line of business app or whatever, orgs that needed to do that stuff, a lot of them just happily or unhappily just kept running it anyway, even though it was out of support, it wasn't getting updates. There are orgs that are still going to take that chance. So with this one, I guess the thing that's really a big different, something that's really different about this one, and I'm curious to see how Microsoft responds to it in their messaging, is a lot of people talking about the potential for the amount of e-waste that this is going to generate. Now, I don't really know if it's going to turn into e-waste. I just think that there'll be, like, a lot of people are going to have really well-equipped home labs and things like that, based on getting access to hardware that you don't necessarily want to run Windows 11 on. So maybe you're going to run server, Win Server or Linux or other things on it. So, but yeah, let's wait.
From an observational point of view, Mark, I don't see this creating any more e-waste than a traditional hardware changeover that most organizations were doing every 3 to 5 years. Like, it's pretty minimal difference. The other thing that I'd love to hear from the crowd is, all right, other than the hardware limitations, are there any blockers or concerns or issues with going to Windows 11? And Dean, I do see your message in there around the multi-app kiosk stuff. I know that's being investigated. I don't know where it's at though. But just curious to hear if there's any other concerns, issues stopping you or your customers getting to Windows 11.
Updating machines hasn't been great, especially Surfaces. Tends to run like a pig, overheat and crash a lot. So we've had to reset a lot of them.
Is that the in-place upgrade?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Do you want to ping me offline, Adrian? I'd be curious to understand that and talk it through.
Yeah, and I guess knowing, like what generation Surface devices, etc. And I think this is just one of the things in general though, and I'll use Surface as an example, but it's really, the ultralights or ultra thin type devices that are using the low power Intel CPUs. I think it's fair to say that those kinds of devices in general, in terms of how they perform with the things you want to run, over time, they degrade way faster than your traditional desktops or laptops. Like in a lot of cases, it might be, a lot fewer cores. Even if it's the same number of cores, the frequency is capped a lot lower, so that things basically, so it doesn't melt the chassis. And for me, it's really been that, like, my entry into that kind of, ultra thin world was with Surface devices. So it was something where, it basically, anyone who thought, oh yeah, we'll get a 5-year life cycle out of these, it was like, maybe, maybe not in the way that you think. So I'm not necessarily, I'm not trying to dismiss what you're saying in any way, shape or form there. But it's those, that kind of form factor is, something that, revisiting it, let's say a year or two after its release, you'd be like, oh, I probably, I should have gotten the next version up, or I should have gotten the i7 instead of the i5, or definitely not whatever the below the i3 option is on some of the devices. Some of those things, and even some of this is stuff that I've been going through firsthand over the last couple of weeks, playing around with a Surface Go 3, and it's the i3 version, and I expected it to do things faster than it does. But maybe I just had the wrong expectations there.
Yeah. So these would be okay spec machines. But I work in an MSP, so they'd have a lot of crap on them too. But my experience of upgrading to Windows 10 was probably better.
Are they, just out of curiosity, Intune Wolf B, or are they still WSUS?
With Intune.
Okay, interesting.
Okay,
and a few HPs as well. Not just all Surfaces. So just my observation.
Okay. Yeah. Now the other thing as well with Surface devices, and I should check to see if this guidance has changed. But one of the things that where you'd really notice with Surface devices was that if you weren't using the Microsoft provided image, the things like battery life and performance were not where you would expect them to be. Now, I don't know if things are more standardized these days. That's probably something I should actually ask some people I know about that, rather than just sort of speculating whether things have changed. But that was something that used to be, or at least during the early years of Surface devices, it was quite, I don't want to say problematic, but it was like there was definitely issues there where, and this is going back to things like even with Microsoft, where the IT team at I'm not under NDA anymore, I can talk about this stuff.
But just remember you're being recorded.
Oh no, this is okay. But I don't know. So this is okay because I don't know what the IT team there currently does, but they would be doing things like pushing out the standard SOE onto Surface devices, and then people would be complaining about this thing gets like 10 minutes of battery life, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if they just sort of resorted back to the Surface image, now obviously there's quite a bit of difference between the baseline Surface image and what an IT department puts together, but it's something that's still sort of I'd still bear in mind there. So this is okay. None of that stuff would be NDA.
At a high level, we follow the processes that every other organization followed. So use the OS that's on the device that was shipped to you.
Yes.
Why reimage it? And
so would you suggest using something like Autopilot to then add things over the top of that, Steve, and then use Windows Auto Patch for ongoing Windows and Microsoft 365 app patch management?
And drivers,
is that perhaps?
Well, obviously, but if your organization isn't ready for Intune managed, then use Config Manager. Just use the factory image. Why do you need to replace it? You can layer everything in. Probably just to double click on what Dean's mentioned in the chat is yes, make sure you have the latest firmware and everything associated onto all of your devices, especially Surface devices. There has been situations in the past where firmware not being installed has led to batteries not being conditioned correctly and swelling has occurred. So, but if you're doing updates via Windows Update for Business, the default is to have drivers installed from Update for Business, which includes all of the Surface required / mandatory drivers and firmwares to be installed. So you should be pretty well covered off. I was more curious to understand the pain points that you're running into and how that can be mitigated.
Okay, so final thing here, and this is the surprise one. So I mentioned that we've got something related to Teams, even though Teams is something that we generally don't talk about at all. And all I really wanted to highlight here is that the Teams DLP capabilities that you get if you're working with things like an Office 365 E5 or M365 E5 or the compliance add-ons, etc., they haven't really been doing any kind of license check to see does that user actually have that license applicable, enabled there. And the reason why I think this one is important, not because of Teams, but I don't know if this is the first time we've seen it, but it's the first time that I've really taken notice of like a premium feature that is enabled at the tenant level, or that was enabled at the tenant level rather than enabled at a per user basis based on licensing. So this is, I think, the first one I've seen where they've made that switch. And where I think this is the kind of thing where like I've been waiting for something like this to happen for quite a while. And probably the easiest scenario that has probably, they've been asked about the most over the years is around Azure Active Directory Premium. So someone going, and how many of you have had the conversation with someone where they go, okay, so do I just need to buy one AAD P1 or P2 license to enable that feature for all of my users? So who has had that conversation with somebody, or who has been confused about that topic? So that's something that, whereas you could sort of think of just how badly things could break if they did that over on the Azure AD side, if they started really putting enforcement in place. Think of what would happen to, like with a conditional access policy. Would it just block you, or would it not apply the policy? Either option is going to be problematic. So really here, just the thing that I want to stress with this is like making sure that you're not just applying it to a bunch of users as opposed to, any of these, like any of the premium SKU or edition features. Make sure you're licensing them or assigning the capabilities and the policies to the users who are licensed for it, so that you don't end up having a bunch of users who you think are being protected, but not being protected. And the way that this one works is if you're setting up a DLP policy for across multiple O365 productivity workloads, but the user doesn't have the Teams licensing, for example, it will the things that can apply from that policy will apply, and the things that won't apply or can't apply won't apply. So you'll kind of have a half deployed. You'll have a policy that's saying I have successfully deployed because it has, but you'll have a bunch of users that the policy isn't actually applying to. So just keep an eye on that, because I'm sure that, especially with things that you may have set up pretty early, some of the first tenants that you got your hands on, I think that's something where there's quite a bit of scope for things like, especially Azure AD premium features to be maybe possibly too broadly implemented across non-licensed users. Okay, so that's it. I'm not going to talk about Teams, and I'm not going to talk about DLP. It's just really that scenario. And let me just grab the link for this one. I guess this is the final piece. Now, the good thing here is that the link here ties back into, we haven't looked at this page in a long time because it gives us nightmares, but it's the one that goes through and talks about the different products, premium features, and how you should restrict what users they're assigned to. So if it's enabled at the tenant level, how to restrict it from being licensed at the how not to assign it at the tenant level. And in some cases you couldn't really do it, but I think we're seeing more cases now where there are better ways of restricting things versus years ago, where it's like basically where it was user honesty was the only thing you could really follow there. Okay, so that brings us into the topic that I think most people are here for. So Windows Labs. Now, for the sake of convenience, I'm going to call it Labs from here on. I am not going to say Windows Labs for Azure AD, even though it may be written in a few slides. We'll just call it Labs. Now, I just wanted to start off here, and before we get into what's actually on this slide, if you're already in Azure AD joined environments, how many of you are sort of there thinking, is it even worth bothering enabling a local admin account and using Labs to manage it? So is anyone in that situation, or has anyone got thoughts about that?
Well, I think the bigger question, Mark, is how many people on the call today have local admin accounts in their environment compared to not? So if we can get a show of hands of how many people have local admin accounts in their environments, and it's a mission critical requirement.
Okay, so a follow-up then from Steve's question. Is that on the client side, or is it mostly on the server side that you've got that requirement?
Client. Unfortunately, there are quite a lot of processes that don't work 100% as documented, and you still need some way of signing onto a machine to do something to it.
Yeah. Because I guess
I'm looking at autopilot specifically.
I'd be curious to understand that one, but again, let's not
derail
the conversation, and we can
no,
talk
that's what I'm
about
saying.
that offline.
I'm just talking about specifically where it's needed, and it's still in those kind of early stage device. So it's still needed when the device is being provisioned in the early phases of that. Once the device is in an environment and settled down, I don't think there's specifically a need. No.
Yeah, so for me, because I guess for me with like AAD joined probably like the main scenario where I could kind of agree with someone that you needed it, like outside of some special point in time requirement, with things where they're saying, oh, well, what if the machine doesn't have internet connectivity and or their network connections are broken and somebody needs to sign in as a local account. And for me with those, it's like mostly you're creating a scenario that's probably not likely going to occur. Now, even though it probably might occur, it's still something that for me was the effort of having a local admin account or even thinking about a local admin account versus just whichever Azure AD groups you want to give permissions to, assuming that, that there's going to be connectivity 99.9% of the time anyway for this kind of thing. So basically I sort of haven't really missed laps on the Azure AD side. Like completely understand the domain joined machines, your non-DCs, as well as the DC functionality that you get on the server side. But for AAD join, it's something where I can see the attraction here for orgs that whether it is actually a technical requirement or if it's carrying over an on-prem belief system that they are taking into the cloud. And it's just one of those things that means, one less thing that's keeping them on hybrid joined or AD joined devices. So from that side, I can see that, definitely some benefits there. But otherwise, with this, it is nice. It's ridiculously easy to set up. No additional software required. Your April 2023. We'll talk about specific versions of Windows shortly. But it's just the simplicity of it. I think it's probably going to drive usage of it to a degree. For orgs that may have been on the fence or thinking, oh, we won't bother carrying it forward from on-prem into the cloud, I could see this might tilt them towards continuing on in the cloud. Now, so if we just sort of go through here, on the first few slides, I've just got some stuff in here that mixes some on-prem stuff alongside the client, cloud AAD joined devices. We'll only focus on the AAD joined side. We're not going to talk about Windows Server or your hybrid or AD joined devices. So some of the scenarios here, as I mentioned, we're really not going to talk about the majority of them. We'll talk about this one here, the backup local admin account passwords to Azure AD. Now, I guess it's probably the other thing here that's important is backing up is fine, but you know what's better than backing up? Being able to get access to them when you need them. Basically, backing them up as well as being able to get access to them. But in this case, there's they're not. It's not a cloud-only release like it does. As you can see here, your servers, AD, etc., that you've had in previous or the previous version is there. So think of this just more as the natural development of what Labs is needed to do for a very, very long time. Now, on the licensing side, nothing too special here, but there is some stuff that's kind of weird in here, which is the Azure side. I haven't really seen where that kicks in, but it's on the Intune side. And because on the Azure side, as long as you've got Azure AD free or above, which, please take it, it's yours. But then the Intune related features, this is one that I want to see some clarification of this in terms of, is this one of those things where if the users are being managed through Intune, or this is something where even though technically you don't need, or they're saying that you don't have to use Intune, but in that case you'd be pushing it back against on-prem AD, as far as I'm aware. So here, does anyone want to chime in, Steve or Kwok, if you are comfortable with it? If the answer is no, you're not comfortable, I'm happy with that. But is it a fair assumption that the user, in order to manage it the way that we'll show it today, that I'll show it using Intune, you'd really, Intune it's an Intune policy setting, which makes me think the user would need an Intune license.
We'll take a step back from that, right? So the process to set the policy and the settings that can be sent out there using the CSP protocol, that's all part of the AAD free SKU. Why that's important to call out is then our partnerships over with Workspace ONE, with any of the other vendors, they can also leverage that and present it out. So depending on your management platform, you can go and use this service. Ideally, we want you to use Intune because it's just simple and it's a tick box, but there's nothing stopping any of the other service providers that manage Windows OSs utilizing this functionality.
Yeah,
and that's why it's split.
Yeah, and down here, and the reason why it's worded like that, I lifted that wording directly from learn.microsoft.com because I just thought it was weirdly worded, which, yeah, and I guess I guess the thing with this is that some people may choose to interpret this as may does not mean must. Like may is a suggestion, not a requirement. So yeah, but down here, yeah, I'd say it is for what we're about to do, it is a requirement. We're using Intune. Now, in terms of where it's supported, now I know this is going to shock people, but in the blog post where they announced some of this functionality, who wants to guess what questions were asked or comments were made based on what platforms it's available on? Any guesses from anyone? Yeah, so basically, yeah, so Barani, yeah, so other operating systems, people going, what about Server 2016? What about Server 2012? What about Server 2008? And it's like, well, I don't see any of them on the list. So my assumption would be, no, they are not, that they're not there. So yeah, so basically from these, it's just built in, and and some of you who were on the call earlier saw that basically, like, I spun up a VM like minutes before the session started up, and it just went. It was like a Windows 11. I think it was 22. Actually, I'm not even sure which Windows 11 version it was. It was just whatever the one that Hyper-V pulls down when you say, give me a Windows 11 image. And it was an incredibly painless process. Now, just to tie back into some of the things that Steve just mentioned is that if you are looking at working with third-party MDM solutions, you can go through and use CSP policies with this. And just to sort of show you here, I manually created them over in Intune anyway, just so that you can see the 7 that are supported in here. So if we just jump into configuration, policies, and Windows Labs. Okay, so in this case, just to sort of take note of a few of the things that I've got in here. So to use it, you only actually need to put in one setting, one CSP setting, this one here, backup directory. And then the others are just optional if you don't want to use the default settings. And the default settings, things like the number of days, password complexity requirements. Most of them are integer. The admin account details is a string. But otherwise, like even if someone is using another MDM solution, like it's going to take 2 minutes to put this into it. There's really not much to it. Any of you who've sort of had to look at the CSP documentation know that you can just sort of click on copy, copy to get the OMA URI, and just making sure you're choosing the right, the right value option in there. So pretty quick process. But we'll sort of do talk about a few other things in a moment and come back and show how you should do it. Now, the other thing as well that's important down here is that it, enabling it doesn't create an admin account, nor does it enable a disabled admin account, nor does it remove the non-expiry of passwords from a default admin account. So they are things that you'll need to to do yourself. So whether so what's going to be a best practice here? For a lot of orgs, they'll leave the default admin administrator account disabled. They'll create something else, and using the account CSP, you can go through and have it randomize characters, etc. That's in there. So yeah, so that not every device has got the same admin name and password, for example, a corresponding password. So if you do need to create it, you know, just go through user accounts CSP to go through and do that. Now, other things to watch out for with this is that even if there's an invalid admin account setting, it's still going to report success that the policy is applied, because it's going through and it's deploying the policy, at which point it will say, yes, the policy is good, even if there's not a valid admin account to apply it to. Now, if we quickly switch over, I hope this has not changed versus how it was looking prior to leaving things running in the background. Let's just jump into, oops, endpoint security, account protection. Now I'll talk, yeah, so this is just where we go through and we can configure it on, I'm sort of showing you the Intune side first, but this is kind of second place you should go. Now you'll notice in here that I've got one succeeded and one error. Now in this case, if we jump in and we take a look at that, if we drill down into the machine that's failed, the reason is that it has not received the April updates yet. So in that case, because there's no, there's no corresponding CSP hooks in there, none of the settings can apply at all. So this is different to what I was saying where, until we go and validate it, like if we jump back to here, this one here that's saying that it's actually successful, I won't know for sure that it's successful until I actually check on that. So there has to be some policy that's followed to make sure there's consistency in the way that you're handling those local admin accounts. Now, in this case, if we jump in and we take a look at this one, we can see here that all of them have succeeded. And the place where we go through and actually administer that on the Intune side is if we jump in and let's just choose that WinDev machine, so WinDev 2304. And if we jump into local admin password, then in this case, you can see that we've got that password. Now, I don't think any of you have got access to this VM, so I should be okay showing you that password over there. So in this case, you can see we've got a local admin password. This VM gets destroyed soon anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But some important things that we, sorry, Steve, yeah?
No, I was just going to say the same as what you're about to do.
Oh, okay. So in this case, you can see I've just been lazy here because I was sort of in a rush to get it up and running. I just enabled the local admin account rather than going through and using, creating a user through CSP. We can see when the last password rotation was. We can see when the next password rotation is. So that way we can go through and basically see some of those details in there. Now, the flip side of that in terms of, let's just sort of quickly jump over to where we actually configure things. So just in Azure AD devices, and then you've got local admin settings enabled in there. So just turn that on. And then over here, basically, in this case, if we want to see the local password, we could do it over here. So this is one of those things where you can see that, based on what role has somebody got. If someone is identity focused and not device focused, this is where they'll stay. If someone is device focused, they're not going to jump into the Azure AD portal in order to do that.
So one thing that I'll add in there, Mark, just want to close it out, is if we go back to the AAD portal, that's where you'll be seeing if your policy is applying correctly or not, because you'll be able to see how many passwords have been found for the devices. So if you're sitting there and doing testing and validation, you're like, yeah, cool, I've got success for all of my policies. Just go and validate that you've got an equivalent count of the devices that's supposed to be hitting you. This is while you're doing your testing and validation and building confidence in the solution, but it should all just work without any issues.
And just a follow-up question. How many of you do rename, or not rename, but how many of you create your own, for this, will create your own admin account that's got a non-standard account name? Or how many of you will just stick with admin or device admin, something along those lines? How many of you are just going to use the built-in admin account?
We rename them to something that's not admin or administrator.
Not, yeah, not quite as obvious. Yeah, and that's the other issue. Yeah, and thanks for calling it out, Adrian. Is making sure that creating a new one so it doesn't have that SID sitting there. Okay, so so in terms of the setting it up and the configuration, if we just go back over and we take a look, oops, too far, and that's not where I wanted to go anyway. If we just go back in and we take a look at what the options are, let's just create a new policy. And pretty simple. So backup directory. Now, important things to note here is you can only back up to Azure AD or to AD. You can't back up to both. So in the documentation, there's a ton of stuff around about migration, working in basically not emulation mode, but what's the term they use? I'll try to take a look at it. But basically, we're trying to running it in very similar ways to how you would have run it previously. But obviously, in this case, we want Azure AD. How many days? What's the account admin name? And in that example I showed you, obviously I had administrator. What password complexity do we want? And in this case, it's something where large letters are probably not the best option. Making sure that I would be going for large letters plus small letters plus numbers plus special characters. And you already saw that in the example that we had. The default is 14. I think the minimum we can have is 8. And then we can have some, after authentication, what are the options? And what's the reset delay that we've got. So in this case, it's a matter of pretty much showing us the things that we saw over in the CSP setting, but obviously a lot easier just to go through here.
So the one to call out here is the post authentication reset delay is in hours.
Okay. Yep.
Maximum of 24 hours. So once you've obtained it and start to use it, you've got 24 hours by default. Otherwise, you've got to you need to change that to whatever you want. But it's maximum of 1 day. So that's to limit the risk associated with the account being active for longer than that time.
Yeah.
I'm calling that out because we don't say that unless you hover over the eye.
Okay, so a few more things then on this. I think we've covered everything on that slide. So obviously there are PowerShell commandlets. So in this case, you can see that there's not necessarily a corresponding legacy commandlet for situations where things just don't apply. So basically, there's no shortage of documentation on these. We won't go through them. Now, for the deployment side, we went through this stuff to a degree already, but I've noticed that I did this. I knew I'd get a reaction from Steve on this one. Notice that just a reminder that Azure AD is part of Microsoft Entra, in case you weren't aware. And I'm sure you are all very, very aware of that. Okay, so really here it's just a matter of it'll take a while for me not just to go to like regular Azure AD. I'm sure eventually I'll get used to just jumping into Entra. But as you can see though, for these, there are actually slightly different ways to get to the settings. Nothing major, but slight differences. And then on the Intune side, you saw that we just go through and configure policy under account protection. So pretty simple stuff. Then the other thing here is like on the password management side. So we already had a look at it in what we can do in Azure AD as well as in Intune. But obviously, you want to do, if you want to do it, get access to it via Microsoft Graph, then the get lapse AAD password, basically, it's basically going to use Microsoft Graph to go through and get that information. But other things as well, and this is probably something I should have spoken about. If we just go back to the PowerShell slide, there's one other thing I wanted to cover here. So this one here, the reset lapse password, just if you're doing testing to make sure things are working as expecting, just just go through and PowerShell is going to be a pretty easy way to go through and do that. Obviously, I think you'd also need to make sure you were doing it with an account that had the appropriate permissions as well.
Yep. If you've got automation built on doing graph calls, there is a new graph endpoint, well, not graph endpoint, but graph scoping permissions that have been created for this. So, yeah.
Yeah. Now, another thing that answered a question I had that I asked of Steve is when you're going through any of the documentation for Labs, be careful that you're not looking at Windows Server documentation because you'll start finding that there are a bunch of steps that are not really the things you should be doing, such as registering an Azure AD application and assigning the appropriate graph device permissions, etc. to it.
So Mark, Roger's got his hand up.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Sorry, so I thought I'd just quickly mention, I think just on the previous slide with that get labs AAD password, just something to be aware of. I'm not sure if it's obvious, but I'll put the docs link in. I don't know if that calls it out, but you actually need to create an enterprise app for that. So if you have a look at that page and look at some of the examples, you'll see the examples do connect to Graph, but they also require like a client ID and so on. So just something to be aware of, that there's potentially some extra setup that's not there by default. Yeah, so during the private preview, that was actually the only way to get the password. And so you had to go and create this enterprise app, like an enterprise app registration, which some people might be familiar with. And if you look at the examples, that's what's alluded to there, where you've got like a client ID that you put in. So I can't recall, I'm just looking at the graph page, sorry, the docs page now to see if we explain how to create that. It doesn't look like we explicitly do, at least not on that initial page. I didn't find it offhand, but just be mindful of that. If you go through the standard stuff in the UX, then if you look at the examples anyway, you wouldn't really have a client ID, right? Without having gone into Azure AD and created that. It does mention the permissions you need, which is a good start, but I don't think it explicitly gives you a step-by-step on how to create the enterprise app ID.
Yeah, let me check. So there was another page. So one of the pages that I closed off, let me see if I can find it. Okay, so it was one of the, let's just do a search for a reg. Okay, not that one. Okay, so I think, okay, hopefully this isn't the same page that you've got, but this, okay, so I think this page gives a little bit more detail on the Labs and Azure AD. But but even with this one, it's assuming that people, actually, let me just make sure this is the page that I'm thinking of. Oh yeah, so it is. So yeah, so in here, I think even one of the things in here where they're kind of assuming that people know some of the extra things about app registration is, even though it's talking about, what permissions you need to be applying, I think one of the things here where it's talking about, where it's kind of just pointing out to a generic register an application page. Let's just see, let me just check the terminology.
Yeah, that would be the one. Yeah, because I just had a look. There is a note in that original page. So I think that's right, because the note in the original page I just pasted in, and it links to the page that you opened before this. And then I guess that second page links to the how to do it here. So I think that probably does have the steps, given that they give you the permissions along the way.
Yeah. So some of the things that I think that aren't quite as obvious from it. Let me just sort of jump in to the app registration page itself. So something where I guess if there's the opportunity for the documentation to be a bit more specific, let me just highlight a couple of the things here. Azure AD, apps, app registration. Okay, let's use this one that's partially created but not configured at all. In the API permissions piece, probably like one of the things that if you want to make the documentation really clear on it or nominate it, even things such as, making sure it's really clear, is the app running on behalf of the user? Is it a background service that's running? So just like a couple of little things like that need to be clarified a bit in the docs, or it could be in the docs somewhere, but when I sort of skimmed through it, it kind of just pointed off to that generic app registration documentation rather than here's the specific path that you need to go down in this case. So I think they're just assuming to a degree that people would have that app registration knowledge, but I don't think that's a good assumption unless somebody is actually registering applications or has done it previously. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, but otherwise though, just in terms of setting it up to use either like the Azure AD portal or the Intune portal to retrieve our credentials, that is like ridiculously easy to get up and running. I didn't have to do any kind of configuration on the client device, just making sure that I could show that example where one of them doesn't have the April updates and then the other one does have April updates. And that's really just the only difference between those two VMs, why one is passing and one is failing. So incredibly easy to implement, but obviously, this is the kind of thing where things around, planning, what password structure you're going to use, what user account names are you going to use. They're probably the more important pieces on the planning side here, because the configuration itself is really, really easy. Okay, just sort of taking a look at chat to see if I missed anything else. Okay, so
hi.
Hi,
Mark. Sorry to disturb.
Hi, yeah.
And could you please explain about this M365 from cybersecurity perspective? I'm new to this tool, but however, I would like to learn.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so really the idea here is that there might be times where you need to sign in as a local admin on a device in order to perform certain, recovery or, admin, maintenance tasks or things like that. So, so in this case, it's something where instead of having, for a lot of organizations that, let's say during the early days of NT and early days of AD, it was pretty common for organizations to have the same admin name. So it would have been administrator and the same password across the entire, all of their servers. The same local admin across all of their servers. My guess is if they were doing that, they were probably using it for AD recovery accounts as well, and potentially on all of their workstations. So obviously, if somebody compromised the environment and was able to figure out what the local password was for an admin on one machine, that would then basically be what you'd be using to try to sign into every other device that you discovered on that network, and basically seeing if that was just something that was commonly used. So in this case, it's something that's going to be unique per device or per user device or per server, so that if someone's machine is compromised, knowing what a local admin account is on their machine is not going to help you on any other machine in the organization.
Yeah, thank you. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and I think I think what this really is just something that needed to be done to discourage people from continuing on with really bad practices in the past.
And is it possible to do it without using Intune? Because a lot of our clients don't use it. We use our own RMM.
Oh yeah, so as long as you can push CSP, you can so do you push it out with? Do you push settings out with group policy?
PowerShell normally.
Sorry?
With PowerShell normally.
Oh, okay, so yeah, so basically, yeah, doing it that way. If we
because
jump
what you
into
would
some of the
do is
documentation,
you'd be deploying it the same as you would group policy. So
yeah,
if you've got a group policy setting out there that sets that registry key, it's going to go and enable it the same way. So it's doable, but you just need to translate the group policy key. And you'll see there on the screen that Mark's on, he just scrolled past a whole heap of registry keys.
Yeah.
You'll see here the local, the lapse group policy or lapse local config. That's where you would set those settings. Ideally, you want to go through the lapse CSP, but that is designed not where you should be writing it directly. So in your scenario where you don't have if you're not using something that is CSP aware, or you're not using Active Directory being group policy, that's where you would set the lapse local config, and then you'd just deploy that out. And as part of that, you'd specify which data store you're wanting to set to back up the keys.
Okay. Yeah. I think I might need to do some more reading and research around this, because I've got a bit of a mixed bag with clients. Some have Active Directory, some have Azure Active Directory, and some are integrated and some are not. So
yeah.
Yeah, and so from there, so then that would then determine like where you'd actually be, potentially, getting, getting access to the passwords from. So those that are AD without any Azure AD, then it would, effectively you'd be going back to AD to retrieve that information versus Intune or the Azure AD portal that you saw the demonstration of.
Okay, thank you, Jen.
Not a problem.
Yeah, but there's definitely no Intune or Azure AD requirement for this. If somebody wants to keep using it with on-prem AD, they can. I guess the challenge is if someone says, well, what if I don't use on-prem AD and I don't use Azure AD? Then my response to that is Azure AD free is your friend. That would be, that would be one way of handling that.
Yeah, I was just going to say so in Richard's scenario there, definitely don't have to use Intune. Obviously, you get some of the niceties of the integration in the user interface and stuff. So, I guess in your case, still doable. You'd be more dependent on like where we spoke about the enterprise application for retrieving the passwords and that PowerShell module. You'd be fully dependent on that because you wouldn't be able to do it in the interface that Mark was showing before, right? Azure AD or Intune. So it just means that things like that would be a necessity for you to set up, whereas other folks that'd be optional.
And you put that link in the comments, eh?
Yeah.
Legend. I'll eyeball that shortly. Thank you.
And that kind of comes back to the licensing. I think like there was a question on the licensing, but just to recap, I guess. The simple version would be like Lapse doesn't have any licensing. That would be the simplest statement. Obviously, you could kind of pick that apart, I suppose. But if you don't overthink it, Lapse itself has no licensing, and that's a true statement. So in your scenario, you're using a different product or a third-party MDM. Like there's nothing inherently different that you're having to pay for if you think about it. Obviously, in saying Lapse has no licensing, which is true. Well, obviously, it comes as part of Windows. So if you want to be legal, you need a license for that, right? If you want to deploy settings through Intune, of course, you need a license for that. But you certainly don't need an Intune license if you're doing, like in your case, where you're just running a PowerShell script. I mean, sure, if you're using a third-party MDM, presumably you need their license, not ours. So, and the Azure AD piece, you can use free. I think, the statement in docs there is more around, we don't have it at the minute, but if you could imagine a scenario in future where you had the help desk folks do an MFA piece, right, to assert some additional security before they could view the password or something, those kind of bolt-on functionalities would, as you'd expect, require P1 or P2. Again, nothing new from that perspective.
Yeah.
sorry, the last piece I was going to mention just quickly is there is a link in docs. I'll just paste in quickly, but no one raised it, but I don't know if it's an issue around for anyone around RBAC and so on. So there's a link there for RBAC, and it kind of doesn't give super granular details at the minute. So there's some stuff coming shortly. It is possible to do it today. If anyone needed to implement RBAC today, you just have to do it through Graph Explorer. And so Docs has not gone into that level of detail yet, because in a couple of weeks, it will be there. So the thought was no point putting it in Docs for a couple of weeks and then it'll quickly change. So there is RBAC and the ability to do RBAC. It's a custom role. There is not Intune has a dedicated role for Labs, but Azure AD does not. So yeah, there's some stuff on RBAC there, but it doesn't explicitly tell you the step-by-step that, today you need to go to Graph Explorer and you need to do a patch. And you need to create a custom role, and it's not that elaborate or explicit, because if you kind of watch that space over the coming weeks, it'll be redocumented to the letter once those permissions are in there. But it'll be a custom role for RBAC, and there also will be support. I don't know if anyone on the call uses AUs, admin units, but in terms of dividing things up, if you had a group of devices like you kind of might do on-prem, where you have different OUs, for example, and you wanted to restrict help desks or anyone's permission to retrieve passwords and so on, the way you typically do that in Azure AD, as much as it's a flat structure, is you'd put things into AUs, right? So admin units. And at the moment, if you go test that out, the custom role for LAPS is not supported. So you won't actually see it appear in the list. But again, that should be fixed before we go to GA, so hopefully in the next few weeks. And then you could foresee a scenario where you had, the devices for, Queensland or Australia or whatever in one AU, and you'd, had a role assigned to that with particular, limitations, permissions, users assigned, etc. And you could kind of divvy it up into different regions or different units, as you might do today if you're using admin units for other functions. So I guess just be aware that functionality is coming if anyone needs that.
Actually, and I'll just show what you mean by the admin units over here. What we'll call it LAPS. Just in case anyone hasn't seen admin units before, is where it's not a huge list of all of the different Azure AD roles that are available, but it's I think it's 3 times as big as it was when the feature first launched. But it means that you can now start picking roles and targeting who gets these roles and what groups of users they apply to. So basically, it's instead of the way if someone's, let's say by default, if you say someone is a groups admin, they'd be a groups admin across the entire tenant. With admin units, we can go through and effectively just start targeting, what particular groups we want you to be, that we want these roles assigned to. But as you can see here, it's compared to the full list of Azure AD roles, it's quite a small list, but it has gotten bigger since it was introduced. Okay, so I'll stop the recording now, just so we can sort of switch into the final section of general discussion. So let me just stop the recording and